The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze across the small western town, the kind that coated everything in dust and silence. The train's whistle echoed like a lonely cry as the iron beast screeched to a halt at the wooden station. From the car stepped a young woman in white, a bride. Her gown, though a little wrinkled from the journey, clung to her like a fragile dream she refused to let go of. In her hand, she carried only a small, worn suitcase, the sum of all her hopes and her future. Her eyes scanned the platform eagerly. She searched for a familiar face, for the man who had promised her a new beginning, who had written sweet words and letters and vowed to meet her at this very station. The crowd thinned, families reunited, children tugged on mother's skirts, and wagons rolled away. But for her, no one came. The longer she stood there, the more obvious her loneliness became. Whispers rose among the townsfolk who lingered nearby. Two women, their baskets filled with laundry, exchanged knowing looks. "Poor thing," one murmured. "Or foolish," the other replied with a chuckle. "Coming all this way for a man who never shows." A group of young cowhands leaned against a fence, snickering under their breath. Their laughter pricked like needles, and she lowered her gaze, clutching her suitcase tighter. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Her excitement, once bright in her chest, began to sink into dread. Perhaps the train was late. Perhaps he was delayed. She tried to convince herself, repeating the words in her mind like a prayer. But as the last of the passengers drifted off and the platform emptied, truth began to settle heavy inside her heart. He wasn't coming. The station master gave her a pitiful glance as he locked the office door. "Ma'am," he said gently, "best find a place in town before nightfall." But his kindness only made her throat ache worse. With trembling legs, she walked a few paces to a bench at the far end of the platform. There she sat, folding her dress carefully beneath her, as if preserving the last dignity she had. She placed the suitcase at her feet, hands folded in her lap, her veil slipping slightly from her hair. The town carried on, wagons rattling, voices drifting, the sun dipping lower. Yet around her, a silence grew, thick and merciless. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the horizon. The dream she had clung to, the promise of being wanted, cherished, chosen, it shattered in the dust of that forgotten platform. And as the first tear rolled down her cheek, she understood with a hollow certainty. She had been left behind. The town's main street bustled under the late sun. Wagons creaked past. Chickens scattered between boots, and the general store's porch buzzed with chatter. Among the crowd walked a tall, broad-shouldered cowboy, his hat casting a shadow over his rugged face. Beside him skipped a small girl, no more than 7 years old, her braids bouncing as she clutched a small basket for the supplies they had come to fetch. Father and daughter, alone, yet bound together by quiet resilience. They had nearly finished their errands when the little girl tugged her papa's sleeve, her gaze caught by a sight on the far end of the train platform. Sitting alone on a weather-worn bench was a woman in white. Her dress, though beautiful, looked out of place against the dust and grit of the western town. The small suitcase at her feet seemed hardly enough to carry a life. And her face was pale, her eyes red with tears that she tried but failed to hide. The little girl slowed her steps. Children notice pain more sharply than grown-ups, and her tender heart squeezed. She leaned closer to her father and whispered, "Papa, why is she so sad?" The cowboy followed his daughter's gaze. At first, he thought she must be mistaken, but then he saw the truth of it. The empty platform, the wedding gown, the way the woman sat so still, as though the weight of the world had pressed her down. A pang, sharp and unexpected, hit him square in the chest. He had buried his wife years ago, and since then he had trained himself to be stone, strong for his daughter, untouchable to grief. But watching that lonely bride, something inside him shifted, as if an old scar had been touched. He did not answer his daughter right away. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the store porch, giving himself an excuse to linger. From where they stood, he could still see the bride. She brushed at her tears quickly, as though ashamed to be caught weeping. The sight made his jaw tighten. The little girl tilted her head, still studying the stranger. She looks like the angels Mama used to tell me about, she said softly. But angels aren't supposed to cry, are they? The cowboy swallowed hard. His daughter's words dug deeper than she knew. He knelt beside her, straightening the basket in her hands to buy himself a moment. Sometimes, he murmured, even angels get hurt. His eyes drifted back to the bench where the bride sat, fragile against the vast emptiness of the station. Something about her loneliness called to him, though he could not yet name why. The little girl reached up and slipped her tiny hand into his. "Can't we help her, Papa?" Her voice was hopeful, almost pleading. He didn't answer, not yet. A man like him, hardened by loss, cautious of strangers, knew better than to invite more heartbreak. But as he stood there, watching forgotten bride sit quietly in her sorrow, he felt his silence heavy, almost cruel. The town moved on, uncaring, but his daughter's innocent question refused to leave him. For the first time in years, the cowboy wondered if maybe fate had put someone in his path for a reason. And so, while the sun began to dip behind the rooftops and the sky turned shade of amber and rose, the widowed cowboy kept his quiet watch his heart, against his will, stirred by the sight of a bride left behind. The sun had already begun its slow descent, painting the edges of the sky with shades of orange and rose. The station was emptying, townsfolk drifting away after their curious glances at the abandoned bride. She still sat on that weathered bench, her suitcase at her feet, her lace gloves trembling slightly as she tried to hold herself together. Every few minutes, she stole a glance down the dusty road. Still no one came. The ache in her chest grew heavier. The cowboy shifted uneasily by the store porch, arms crossed, his hat pulled low. He told himself it wasn't his business. People came and went in this harsh land. Some promises were broken. Some hearts were left behind. That was the way of life. But his daughter, standing by his side, couldn't look away. Her young eyes shimmered with both sadness and curiosity. Finally, the little girl tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, can I go talk to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy stiffened. "Best not, darling. Sometimes folks want to be left alone." But his daughter shook her head with determination that was far too big for her small frame. She shouldn't be alone. Mama wouldn't like that. Before he could stop her, the child slipped from his side and marched toward the bench, her little boots kicking up dust. The bride looked up at the sudden sound. Startled, she wiped at her cheeks quickly, embarrassed to be caught crying. But then she froze when she saw who had approached. A little girl with braided hair, big hopeful eyes, and the most earnest face she had ever seen. The child stood in front of her for a moment, fidgeting with her basket strap, then leaned in closer and asked softly, in a voice full of innocence, "Are you the angel Mama sent for us?" The bride's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, already fragile, trembled at the words. For a moment she forgot her pain, forgot the cruel humiliation of being left behind. She could only stare at the little girl, blinking back tears, overwhelmed by such a pure and impossible question. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I think you must be mistaken, sweetheart," she whispered, though her chest ached in a way that made her want to believe otherwise. The little girl tilted her head, studying her with quiet certainty. "No, Mama told me she'd send someone kind, someone who'd make Papa smile again." Her voice wavered slightly on the last words, as though she was afraid of saying too much. Behind them, the cowboy had stepped forward, awkward and stiff, his boots heavy against a wooden platform. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the silence. "Darling," he said to his daughter, his voice gruff but not unkind, "don't trouble the lady." But the child only turned toward him, her chin jutting stubbornly, as though she had inherited his grit. "She's not troubled, Papa. She's sad, just like us." The bride's gaze flickered between father and daughter, confusion mingling with an ache she could not name. The cowboy looked every bit as hard as stone, his broad shoulders, his weathered face, his guarded eyes. Yet the little girl's words carried a truth that pierced through all of it. The bride swallowed, clutching her hands in her lap. "I didn't mean to cause any concern. I'm just waiting." Her voice faltered. She couldn't finish the sentence. Waiting for a groom who would never come? For a future that had already shattered? The words tasted like ashes. The cowboy shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He wasn't good with strangers, especially ones draped in sorrow. But his daughter wasn't done. She reached up and touched the bride's gloved hand with her tiny fingers. "You can come with us," she said simply. "We've got a ranch. It's big and lonely, but it's nicer when there's more laughter. You could stay." The bride blinked rapidly, stunned. "Stay," she echoed, as though the word was foreign. The little girl nodded eagerly. "Yes, Papa makes the best cornbread, and I can show you the horses. You don't have to sit here waiting for someone who doesn't want you. You can come with us." The cowboy ran a hand down his jaw, his chest tightening at his daughter's boldness. "Now hold on," he began, but the child cut him off with a determined look. "Please, Papa. She looks like she needs us. And maybe we need her too." The silence that followed was thick. The bride felt tears rising again, but this time they weren't only of sorrow. Something in her heart shifted at the child's innocent invitation, at the way hope could come from such a small, unassuming voice. And though the cowboy stood rigid, uncertain, even he could not deny the way his daughter's words stirred something deep inside him, something he thought had long turned to stone. The station was nearly empty now, the train long gone. The bride sat in her white dress, no longer just a woman who had been left behind, but someone who had just been seen, chosen, in a way she had never expected. And for the first time since the platform had gone silent, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier, because of one innocent question that had cracked open her broken heart. The wagon wheels creaked along the dirt road, every bump and jolt rattling through the bride's bones. She sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside the cowboy's daughter, clutching her little suitcase to her lap. She had agreed, hesitantly, uncertainly, to leave the station, but now that the town had disappeared behind them, a knot of fear twisted tighter in her chest. What was she doing, following strangers into the wilderness? The little girl, though, kept sneaking soft, reassuring smiles her way, as though her presence alone was enough to keep the shadows of doubt at bay. When the ranch finally came into view, the bride's breath caught. It was rugged, weather-beaten, and stretched wide under the endless sky. Fences leaned here and there. The barn had seen better days, and the fields whispered of both hard work and neglect. Yet there was something about it, something raw and alive. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the main cabin, and the sound of distant horses carried on the wind. To her surprise, it didn't feel forbidding. It felt waiting. The cowboy helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady but his eyes averted, as though he wasn't sure what to make of her. "It ain't much," he muttered, jerking his head toward the cabin. "But it's home." She followed him up the porch steps, her boots tapping nervously against the wood. The door creaked open, and a wave of warmth met her, a faint scent of cornbread, the glow of fire, and walls that seemed to hum with quiet life. Inside, everything was simple: worn furniture, patched curtains, and shelves lined with books that had clearly been read more than once. The bride hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed by the sudden sensation that she was intruding on something sacred. But the little girl grabbed her hand without hesitation and pulled her inside, as if to say, "You belong here now." The cowboy cleared his throat and motioned toward a small door down the hall. "There's a room you can use. Might not be fancy, but it's clean." He opened it to reveal a modest space, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a wooden dresser, and a single window looking out toward the horizon. No lace, no finery, no grand gestures, just a place of rest. The bride set her suitcase down gently on the quilt, her hands trembling as she traced the stitching. It wasn't much, but it was hers, even if only for the moment. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt a flicker of safety, a fragile ember, but it glowed warm in her chest. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside her door, she could hear the murmur of the cowboy's voice, the patter of little footsteps, the crackle of firewood, the sound of a home, not hers, but still a home. She pressed her hand to her heart, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed the faintest thought to whisper through her mind. Maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. Night draped the ranch in silence, save for the faint howl of wind threading through the fields. The bride lay on a narrow bed in her borrowed room, eyes fixed on the ceiling where moonlight spilled through the window. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, memories surged, sharp, jagged things that cut into her chest. She saw the train platform again, the empty space where her groom should have stood. She felt the heat of her family's cold words. "You're not wanted here. Don't come back." Those rejections clung to her like chains, reminding her she was nothing more than an abandoned promise. In the next room, the cowboy sat by the dying fire, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tight. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by years of loss. His little girl had long since fallen asleep, but he couldn't bring himself to follow. The bride's presence in his home had unsettled something inside him, something he thought he had buried when his wife died. He remembered her laughter, soft as spring rain, and the day it was silenced. Since then, he had locked his heart away, convinced love only brought pain. The bride turned onto her side, hugging the quilt close. The fabric smelled faintly of cedarwood and hearth smoke, grounding her in the present. Yet her mind kept dragging her back. People had always made her feel disposable, her groom's absence only the cruelest proof of it. Here, though, in this quiet ranch house, she felt an unfamiliar ache. Safety brushed against her, but fear whispered louder, "It won't last." Nothing ever does. Meanwhile, the cowboy leaned back in his chair, staring at the crack in the ceiling beams. He had built this ranch with his wife's dreams woven into every nail and plank, but after her passing, it had become nothing more than a shelter of sorrow. He told himself he lived only for his daughter now, that his own heart had no room left for healing. And yet, the sight of the lonely bride sitting at the train station had struck him like a blow. It was the same hollow look he had seen in his own mirror for years. The night pressed heavy, filled with unspoken ghosts. Two souls under the same roof, each haunted by what they had lost, yet unable to voice it. The bride kept her grief close, afraid that if she spoke it aloud, she would shatter completely. The cowboy carried it silently, too, convinced that speaking of his wife would betray her memory. Both carried wounds too deep to name, shadows of abandonment and grief swirling between them. Still, though unspoken, there was a strange comfort in the shared silence, as though their separate scars recognized each other, even without words. Neither of them knew it yet, but the ghosts of the past, heavy as they were, had begun to shift, not erased, not healed, but softened, simply because they were no longer carried alone. Morning light spilled across the ranch, painting the fields in soft gold. The little girl ran across the porch barefoot, her laughter carrying into the air like music. The bride stood uncertainly near the doorway, still in the plain dress she had worn since the train. She didn't know whether to step forward or retreat back inside. But the little girl decided for her, grabbing her hand with a bright smile, tugging gently. "Come on," she said. "Papa's busy. You can play with me." At first, the bride hesitated. She had never known how to belong, not even in her own family. But the child's warmth was disarming. They began with simple games, chasing each other around the yard, braiding wildflowers into crowns, skipping small stones across the horse trough. The bride found herself laughing softly, a sound that startled her as much as it delighted the little girl. It had been so long since laughter had left her lips that she hardly recognized it. Inside, the cowboy leaned against the doorframe, watching from a distance. His rugged features softened as he saw his daughter's cheeks glow with joy. For years, he had tried to fill the empty spaces in her life, but a father's love could only reach so far. Watching the stranger, this abandoned bride, kneel to braid his daughter's hair or listen intently to her childish stories, stirred something deep within him. His little girl was tasting again the sweetness of motherly comfort, something he thought forever lost. As the day passed, the chores of the ranch became a shared rhythm. The bride followed the child into the barn, where they fed the chickens together. She stumbled at first, nearly dropping the feed bucket, which made the little girl giggle uncontrollably. Later, they helped gather vegetables from the small garden, their skirts brushing the soil as they knelt side by side. Each task, no matter how small, drew threads between them, quietly weaving the fragile beginnings of a bond. When the sun dipped low, They sat by the fireplace in the cabin. The little girl curled up against the bride, resting her head on her lap, eyes fluttering as sleep crept in. The bride gently smoothed her hair, her hand trembling at the tenderness of the act. A warmth bloomed in her chest, something she hadn't dared feel before. She wasn't just wanted in that moment. She was needed. For the first time in her life, she realized what it felt like to belong to someone. The cowboy, sitting in his chair by the fire, caught the sight and looked away quickly, afraid of the emotions rising in him. But inside he knew. His daughter had found a bridge to happiness, and that bridge was the woman fate had left on that train platform. The bride sat still long after the child had fallen asleep, afraid to move and break the fragile spell. Her heart whispered a dangerous longing. What if this could be home? What if she could stay? The thought terrified her, yet it shimmered like a distant star, beautiful, impossible, and pulling her closer with every beat of her heart. The morning began with the smell of fresh bread and the crackling sound of bacon in the pan. The bride stood in the small ranch kitchen, sleeves rolled up, determined to help. She had never really cooked before, not in a way that mattered. But the little girl bounced at her side, offering instructions with the authority of a seasoned chef. You have to flip it quick or it'll burn, she declared, pointing at the sizzling pan. Nervous but trying, the bride attempted to flip. The bacon flew out of the pan, landing right on the floor with a hiss. The little girl gasped, then burst into uncontrollable giggles. The bride's cheeks flushed, and she tried to pick it up, apologizing frantically, but the child's laughter was so infectious that soon she couldn't hold back either. She doubled over, laughing with the girl, until tears stung her eyes. From the doorway, the cowboy leaned against the frame, arms crossed, pretending to scold. That's the most expensive floor bacon I've ever seen, he muttered dryly. The bride looked up at him nervously, but then he cracked the faintest grin, and for a moment the air was lighter than it had ever been since she arrived. Later that day, the little girl insisted they visit the corral. The horses snorted, pawing at the dirt, their glossy coats shining in the sun. The bride approached cautiously, her fingers twitching with nerves. She had never touched a horse up close before. The little girl urged her, "Don't be scared. They can feel it. Just talk to him." So the bride whispered softly, stretching out her hand. The horse snorted, then pressed its warm muzzle into her palm. She let out a surprised laugh, the sound like music drifting across the ranch. The cowboy, standing nearby, quietly marveled at how natural she looked in that moment, gentle, brave, and alive in a way she hadn't been on the station bench. The three of them worked together through the afternoon. The bride helped the child with small chores, fetching water and sweeping the porch, though she often stumbled in her inexperience. At one point she spilled a full bucket of water, splashing herself and the little girl completely. The child squealed, "Now we're wetter than the ducks," and chased her across the yard, the two of them shrieking with laughter. The cowboy watched silently, hiding a smile beneath the brim of his hat. He had lived with silence and grief for so long. He had almost forgotten what joy sounded like. As dusk fell, the kitchen filled once again with the scent of food, though this time there were fewer accidents. The bride and the little girl prepared stew together, the child stirring far too vigorously, splattering both of them. When the cowboy sat down at the table, he found his plate served with a lopsided hunk of bread, far too thick to chew properly. But when he looked at their eager faces, he didn't complain. He ate every bite, even smiled, and the bride's heart caught at the simple gesture of kindness. After supper, the little girl dragged the bride to the porch to chase fireflies. They ran barefoot in the grass, cupping their hands around the tiny, glowing creatures. The bride's laughter rang out again, pure and unguarded, startling even herself. She realized she hadn't laughed so freely since childhood. Something in her chest, something heavy and rusted, shifted loose. She felt alive, almost whole, and it frightened her as much as it thrilled her. Inside the cabin, the cowboy sat quietly, pipe in hand, watching them through the window. The sight stirred something deep in him, something he had buried with his late wife. He had promised himself never to feel again, never to hope. Yet here was this stranger, this abandoned bride, bringing life back into his daughter's eyes, laughter back into house, and warmth back into his own heart. He looked away, swallowing hard. Maybe, just maybe, she belonged here. That night, when the little girl finally fell asleep, the bride lingered by her bedside, smoothing back a stray curl. She whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for showing me how to smile again." The words were soft, but the cowboy, leaning against the doorway, heard them. He didn't speak, didn't move, only let the quiet truth of them sink deep into his guarded soul. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like a place of ghosts. It felt like a home. And for the bride who had once been left alone on a train platform with nothing but a suitcase and broken dreams, this was the first fragile glimpse of what it might mean to finally belong. The storm didn't come with thunder or lightning. It came with wheels grinding over dirt and boots hitting the ground. Word spread fast through the small western town. Strangers had arrived, men with sharp tongues and eyes full of cruelty. The bride froze the moment she saw them step off the wagon, her ex-doll among them, flanked by relatives who had always treated her like a burden. The laughter and light she had rediscovered in the cowboy's ranch seemed to vanish in an instant. Her chest tightened as if invisible chains had locked around her again. The townsfolk gathered as gossip traveled like wildfire. "Isn't it the man who left her?" someone whispered. Another sneered. So she really was unwanted. The bride's hands trembled as memories rushed back. Humiliation at the station, her family's cold eyes, and a rejection that had nearly destroyed her spirit. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to run before their words broke her all over again. Her ex stepped forward, his smirk cruel, his voice dripping with false charm. "There you are, causing quite a spectacle. I see. Did you really think you could play wife without me?" His relatives laughed harshly, their words twisting like knives. The bride opened her mouth, but nothing came out, only fear. Her suitcase seemed to grow heavier in her mind, as if she were once again the abandoned woman no one wanted. But before the whispers could crush her, a shadow stepped between her and the men. The cowboy, rugged, broad-shouldered, eyes steady as the horizon, he stood like a wall no storm could topple. His daughter clung to the bride's hand, her small voice trembling. "Papa, don't let them take her." The cowboy's jaw hardened. He looked straight at the ex-dolla, his tone calm but edged with steel. "She's not alone anymore." The words cut through the crowd like the crack of a whip. The ex laughed mockingly. "And who are you to say that? She's mine by right. She doesn't belong to you." He reached forward, but the cowboy's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with the strength of years spent working land and cattle. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. "She belongs where she is safe," the cowboy growled. "And that's not with you." The bride's breath caught. No one had ever spoken for her before. No one had ever shielded her. Her heart pounded as she looked at his back, the solid frame standing guard. For the first time, she wasn't facing the storm alone. The relatives tried to sneer, but their confidence faltered under the weight of the cowboy's stance. The little girl, eyes fierce despite her fear, piped up with all the courage her tiny body could hold. "Mama sent her for us. You can't take her away." Her innocent voice silenced the crowd more than any threat could. People murmured, softening, their gossip turning into sympathy. The ex's smile cracked, his pride stung by a child's truth and the cowboy's defiance. "This isn't over," he spat, yanking his wrist free. "You'll regret crossing me." With that, he turned sharply, signaling his kin to leave. They mounted their wagon again, dust rising in their wake, but the tension they left behind clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Silence followed, broken only by the murmurs of the townsfolk. Some still whispered, but most now looked at the bride with new eyes, not as the abandoned woman on the bench, but as someone worth standing up for. Her knees shook as she tried to breathe, the weight of fear slowly lifting. She turned to the cowboy, her eyes shimmering. He didn't speak, didn't claim anything for himself. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "You're safe now." The little girl tugged the bride's hand tighter, beaming with childlike certainty. And in that fragile, powerful moment, the bride felt something bloom inside her chest, not just relief, but hope. For the first time in her life, someone had said the words she had longed to hear. She's not alone anymore. The night after the storm in town was quiet, but inside the bride's heart, A war raged. She sat in the small, simple room the cowboy had given her, staring at the moonlight spilling across the wooden floor. Every shadow whispered doubt. You don't belong here. You were left once, you'll be left again. Her hands clutched the edge of her suitcase, the same one she had carried off the train. A single twist of the handle, and she could be gone by morning, free of new attachments before they cut her deeper than the old wounds. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to choke back the tears, but they came anyway. All her life she had been treated as replaceable, a burden too heavy for anyone to carry. Even now, after laughter in the kitchen, warmth by the fire, and the little girl's arms around her waist, she feared it was only a dream, one that would vanish if she dared to hold on to it. The door creaked softly, and the little girl's sleepy voice cut through the silence. Are you leaving? Her small figure stood in the glow of the lantern light, eyes already glistening. The bride's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the suitcase betrayed her, already half-packed. The little girl's lips trembled before her voice broke into a sob. Please don't leave. Mama sent you for us. I know it. The bride knelt, gathering the child into her arms. The little girl's tears soaked into her dress, every word piercing deeper. I already lost Mama. I can't lose you, too. Her tiny hands clung with desperate strength, as if her will alone could anchor the bride in place. The woman's heart cracked under the weight of the child's plea. For the first time, she wasn't just running from loneliness. She was running from love, fragile and fierce, that had found her in the most unlikely place. Footsteps sounded on the porch outside, slow and heavy. The cowboy stood in the doorway, hat in his hand. Shadows carved across his face by the lantern. His eyes moved from a half-packed suitcase to his daughter's trembling form, then to the woman kneeling on the floor. He said nothing at first, but the silence was thick, alive with the unspoken. Finally, his voice rumbled low, steady but raw. You can't keep living like you don't deserve a place to belong. The bride's eyes widened, her breath catching. She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't what they needed, but the words stuck in her throat. The cowboy stepped inside, kneeling so his eyes were level with hers. His daughter, still sniffling, clung to both of them, a living bridge between their broken pieces. Stay, he whispered, the word rough with emotion. Not as a guest, not as a burden. Stay as family. The bride's tears spilled freely now, her hands trembling against the child's back. She shook her head faintly, caught between longing and fear. I don't know if I can... The cowboy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, worn and faded with time. He opened it, revealing a delicate silver locket, simple, but polished from years of care. His thumb brushed over its surface, his eyes clouded with memory. This belonged to my wife, he said quietly. I thought I'd never take it out again. Thought my heart was done with hope. But my little girl, he glanced at the child, who looked up with wide, tear-bright eyes. She reminded me that life doesn't stop. It just asks us to be brave enough to start again. He placed a locket gently into the bride's hand. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you'll never face the world alone again. Not while I'm breathing. The weight of the locket in her palm felt heavier than gold. It wasn't just a gift. It was trust, a piece of his past offered as a bridge to their future. Her chest ached with the force of her emotions, but for the first time, the ache didn't come from loss. It came from the terrifying, beautiful possibility of belonging. The little girl sniffled, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. See? Mama wanted you here. Her small fingers touched the locket, as if sealing the vow. The bride closed her eyes, clutching it tight. Her voice broke, but it carried truth. I'll stay. The cowboy let out a breath that seemed to carry years of silence, of walls built high and kept firm. He reached forward, resting a rough, callous hand over hers, his eyes holding hers steady. No grand declarations, no fancy words, just a simple, profound promise in the stillness of the ranch house. And in that moment, under the quiet night and the weight of shared pain, a new family began to take root. The first rays of dawn spilled across the horizon, washing the ranch in soft hues of gold and rose. For years, the land had felt barren, haunted by silence and shadows of grief. But this morning, there was something different in the air, a stillness that was not empty, but whole. The bride stood at the window of her new room, gazing out at the wide fields. Where once she had seen only loneliness, she now saw promise. The soil seemed alive again, as though even the earth itself had chosen to bloom with her heart. She touched the silver locket resting against her chest, fingers trembling slightly. It no longer felt like a borrowed piece of someone else's story. It felt like a bridge, binding her to the family that had claimed her not out of duty, but out of love. She whispered softly to herself, as though to anchor the truth. I am not unwanted anymore. In the kitchen, she found the little girl already awake, trying her best to set the table. The small one glanced up and grinned, the gap in her teeth making the smile even sweeter. Mama always said mornings mean new beginnings. Do you think that's true? The bride knelt, cupping the child's face, her eyes wet with emotion. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. More true than I ever knew. The cowboy entered quietly, as he always did, his presence filling the space without demanding attention. He carried the weight of years on his shoulders, but now his eyes held something steadier, gentler, peace. He watched as his daughter leaned into the woman's arms, the two of them giggling over a crookedly placed plate. His lips curved into a smile, faint but genuine, the kind that belonged only to a man who finally dared to hope again. Later that day, the bride walked through the fields with both of them. The ranch stretched endlessly, a rugged but sacred space. Wildflowers had begun to spring at the edges, defying the hard soil. She brushed her hand across them, marveling. It was as though the land itself mirrored their healing hearts, once withered, now daring to flourish. The little girl twirled in circles, her laughter echoing across the open sky, while the cowboy walked beside her, silent but steady. The bride glanced at him, her heart swelling with an ache that was no longer sorrow, but gratitude. That evening, they sat together on the porch, the sky painted in a wash of lavender and gold. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of the land. Crickets in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the wooden swing. Yet the silence between them was not heavy. It was full of love, of acceptance, of something deeper than words could ever reach. The little girl nestled herself between them, her head against the bride's arm, her small hand slipping into her father's. We're a family now, right? She asked softly, her voice drowsy with sleep. The cowboy glanced at the bride, his eyes steady on hers, waiting for her answer. She felt her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the overwhelming certainty that she belonged here. She placed her hand gently over the little girl's, then over the cowboy's, binding them together. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking into a smile. We are a family. The cowboy's hand tightened around hers, firm and reassuring, while his daughter sighed happily, drifting off against him. The bride leaned back, the weight of old rejections finally slipping from her shoulders. She no longer carried the title of an unwanted bride. Here, on this porch, with this man and his child, she carried something far greater, the role of a wife, a mother, and a woman finally a home. The sunrise of the next morning was brighter than any she had seen before. She stepped outside with them once more, the three of them standing side by side, gazing out at the land. The cowboy reached for her hand without hesitation, and she let him, holding fast. The little girl squeezed in between them, her laughter scattering into the new day like a blessing. And as the light spilled across the fields, touching every corner of the ranch, the truth settled deep in her heart. She had come into their lives broken, unwanted, cast aside by the world. But here she was chosen. Here she was cherished. And here, at last, she was home. Final line. She came unwanted and broken, but here she was chosen, cherished, and finally home.